The checkerboard pattern, it's not just the background of a digital image, it's the digital representation of absence.
We are in a simulated environment that contains within it chaos and tension and a very high level of control.
The rubber being applied and then removing the paint, for me that's the personal touch.
The physical structure of the building still being intact, there's nothing spattered on the wall.
It does have that feel of a kind of like an early video game where the edges don't quite add up.
So I'll start off my question by saying this room is a ruin. And just keep that there, just pin it on your board. And then I'll start with a little quote, a kind of quote, a little bit of text, and then a question. Through the mist, heavy from dust, I drew a smiley with my fingertip. My question is, how does the exhibition use layers or filters, curtains even, between background and foreground to access its internal mechanisms? Ugh. And what do we see through the smoke? What I found in this show was that I was faced with lots of dismantled layers within, first off the paintings, obviously, which we'll get to in a second, but then also within the actual install, the environment, and then also in the concept. What layers are people seeing within this show? Do you want to start with this painting? How does this painting treat foreground and background?
I suppose based off of your question, one thing that I'm immediately drawn to is like, you see like the grid-like pattern, which is a very standard thing in digital spaces, Photoshop, anything in design. I suppose given your question, what was your question? Foreground and how does she...
Layers. Let's just screw the question. Let's just say layers, foreground, background.
I think that's the first mechanism that she's used that points my mind in that direction.
Where does that appear in digital?
As the background, as the very flat, as the initial starting point.
You know, is there also filters? You know, if we say foreground and background, can we also just flip that idea and say, well, you know, background is past, foreground is now? So how does this address, these are kind of big, complicated questions, and so I'm going to point at you.
So something that we were talking about earlier with the gesso in relation to this is creating such a flat, smooth face for a digital image to be printed onto is like manufacturing a screen out of a canvas, something that has depth and has texture to it. And then the use of the checkerboard pattern, it's not just the background of a digital image, it's the digital representation of absence, because it is transparent, it's coded as transparency. So what we're seeing here through her gestures being the method of allowing us to see through the surface where we have the lady in the image, is providing that kind of absence that is, I guess you could put a meaning to it, like through like fading of a memory through time, or like the taking away of something that existed due to the loss of the towers or the trauma that's related to that. And then obviously like pictorially, this is very like reminiscent of the dust itself, the way that many of the splashes are used as well.
And there's, I mean, so spot on. I think it's really interesting. I think it's also interesting, this idea, you bringing up the absence, because like, you know, again, foreground and background. Background, absence. Foreground, present.
So my question is recreating a personal traumatic event visually cathartic? And if so, how does the process of making support the artist to understand their past?
Yeah, something that we were also talking about, and also gets at the kind of the core of the previous question, was this sense of layering. And to also answer your question, it feels as if she's parsing through different layers of memory, not necessarily only her own memory, but memory maybe of someone who might have been in the tower through the inclusion of this shredder paper on the floor, mixed with sort of these mediatized images that maybe she didn't see these people firsthand on that day, but she maybe saw the aftermath of these images reproduced over and over again, these famous faces of 9/11, right? And then you get different images that do feel like they're maybe getting a bit more of catharsis, like this image behind me here, something that was shared in her community as this story of, you know, whether it be true or folklore in her community of this hand that landed on her friend's balcony. And then these images over here feel a lot more personal, like they're sort of a personal parsing through of what she might have actually experienced on that day. The police car, this image that is a bit ambiguous as to what this face is, and then also this image over here that they feel like very commonplace things that might have actually been seen by the artist on that day. And the memories that she actually has, the flashbulb memories, intermixed with sort of like collective trauma, collective memory of what it might have been like in the space, of what it might have been like to be the person who captured these images of these people who became, you know, the faces of 9/11.
Yeah, there's a couple of different things going on here, like the media images that are so kind of well known to all of us, that have been kind of replicated, you know, hundreds of times. And then the first-hand kind of accounts that are, I guess, like glimpses of things, like, you know, bits of like, you know, bits of face, police car, and so on. And you know, I do kind of, you know, you kind of like wonder how much of when you're actually making and your mind goes through all these different things, how much there's a detachment, isn't there, in these works because they're reproduced. And, you know, how does that, you know, and if, with her making, you can imagine, or any of us kind of making, recreating something, you're going to be having a multitude of other stuff going through your mind.
Just to add to that, I was also thinking about the fact that she was a child when 9/11 happened. And I saw somewhere that she was getting ready for school. So I suspect that at the time, a part of her didn't properly comprehend what was going on, but as she's gotten older and her perspectives have evolved, the weight of that hits a bit different.
Super interesting.
As she gets older. So she's almost re-encountering this as a different person.
What I'm trying to say is that known images stay with us longer because we've seen them and they keep re-emerging again and again. But other images like the position, her position and looking in the police car, or, you know, these smaller paintings, they seem a lot more intimate. I mean, they are intimate, like compositionally, but intimate to the artist. There's a detachment with these ones because they're so known and they're replicated, but the other ones, there's something a lot more personal about them. And I'm kind of thinking, well, you know, maybe these are things that kind of come more from kind of inside.
The way that I would respond maybe to this idea of working through trauma and nostalgia and, you know, almost like catharsis, if that's kind of where we're going with this, is this: we are in a simulated environment that contains within it chaos and tension and a very high level of control.
Yeah, I think we were discussing before that this is like a ruin, but it's, to me, one of the things that's interesting about the installation juxtaposed with the paintings is that it's a moment of sort of impact as well. To me, I read the small paintings as like before. They're sort of intimate. They're not. There's the same sort of material process, but then it's not. To me, these collective memories have been. These are now like shared memories. But every time you reimagine or remember. You actually recreate the event, but it's never the same. And what we're looking at, or at least one reading that I am thinking about, is that the layers that have been added over the top and sort of obfuscating the original image and changing it, and then ultimately with the sort of the rubber being applied and then removing the paint, it's showing that for me, that's the personal touch. That's the artist's direct kind of engagement with the memory herself. But there is this sort of more collective whole, which is why these are these sort of archetype almost characters at this point. But control is something we were talking about a lot, which was that the artist says, like, we're looking at the hand image as well and saying it's quite beautiful, or it's almost quite advertising. It's quite pretty, like, you know, it's a horrific thing, but yeah, it's been very, you know, composed, and the composition is, you know, the artist has been very specific about the way they want this memory to be recreated, and it's really interesting that within this context, that is the way that image is being depicted, and obviously we're surrounded by the ruin, by the rubble. But yet the artist doesn't want to sort of, there is a sort of tension, there is a sort of distance between the raw horror of that day.
But it's an imperfect memory of simulation. Yes. And I think she's working through simulation as a process for almost distancing herself from that maybe raw emotion that she doesn't necessarily want to encounter. I think we were talking before about the subjectivity of her previous work is never that personal. I mean, it is personal, but it's not as shouty personal as this. Like, this is explicitly, you know, connected to not only her trauma, but, you know, her familial trauma, and, you know, on a wider scope, her, you know, a world trauma, and that has many different layers to it. So, you know, for me, we're living in this kind of, we're encountering this spatial organization that has so much control over it, and, you know, entering into a white cube commercial gallery space and turning it into something that is arguably, you know, some kind of attempt to control a situation that exists. But where does that leave us now? Because I feel like slightly frustrated in this space as well, to some extent.
That is kind of a perfect segue, because I was mainly thinking when I came here, to be honest, the paintings were secondary to me. The main thing was the space, and that I just couldn't stop thinking about. And I was thinking, how does Singer use devices throughout the exhibition that engage with traditional depictions of liminal spaces and generative art? Does anyone have any thoughts just based off the question before I start reeling my my thought? Yes, go ahead.
So for me personally, before I'm not born when 9/11 happened. So all the information I know about is from authority, from internet, or just coming to a building that's like typical 90s American office building, people living 9 to 5, happy, and suddenly everything just upside down. I just see from dying flower, those elevator, this like small, gentle detail just offer me so much personal emotion about someone experiencing it, and especially they have trauma about it.
Yeah. And it's that sort of like juxtaposition that's everywhere in terms of the flowers that are alive / dead / fake, but depicting real, as well as this where everyone's described it as being chaotic, but it equally could be confetti as a celebration of something, which is a weird thing to think about in the context of what the show is about as well. The paintings themselves with I don't know if anyone's familiar with the game Assassin's Creed, but it really looks like the coding of Assassin's Creed, where they're filtering in between spaces. But art historically, Vera Molnar's works, which predate the internet, but also did use predate computers and the internet, obviously, but use that. To me, it really calls towards that sort of art historical referencing, particularly clearer in the ones there where the squares are a lot clearer. And I have no doubt that Singer's very much aware of that as a as essentially taking up that similar conversation in her works?
I do get the sense of feeling unwelcome and feeling uncomfortable, especially as someone that I was alive during the event, but I wasn't an age where I would remember or even engage with any sort of media to do with the event. So being in the space where I guess chaos and stillness exist simultaneously with the physical structure of the building still being intact. There's nothing splattered on the wall. It's perfectly manicured, but the floor is chaotic. The subjects in the painting don't really engage with you. I think the only subject that engages with you is the hand that's reaching out. There are little iterations, I guess, in the space of things being caught in moments in time and chaos and stillness existing simultaneously with the gestural marks and the subject, the shred of paper and the construction of the lifts and the walls. I also wonder, as someone that did experience the event, to have the event depicted in such a digitalized way, which isn't a form that would have existed in 2001, and have it presented to us to engage with it in this way is really interesting.
I think the first thing that I want to say has to do with layering, which has been brought up a few times. And I think it's worth being really clear and explicit about what that's referencing in my mind, which is like the paradigm in digital kind of like programs to like layer, like Photoshop layers and stuff like that. Like they are literally called layers. And I think if we're gonna like talk about layering, I think that should be really done justice to kind of as a concept and how it works in this exhibition, such that if I'm looking at that painting, there are a bunch of people in front of me right there. Then there's the shadow grid, I think. Then there's the spray paint, then there's the print, and then there's the bars, and then there's the kind of installation thing, right? And I think that when you bring up layering, and particularly digital layering, which is oftentimes like non-integrative or non-integrating layering, where things don't really interact between layers, they kind of just exist relative to each other and leave transparencies, as in the case of like the space above the painting. I think it's important to kind of like, that is happening with this work, I think pretty successfully, which I think is cool.
I wanted to pick up a little bit on, I don't know if everybody's aware or kind of like familiar with Hito Sterol's kind of idea of this poor image. So the idea is like the more an image is compressed, in order for it to be dispersed and distributed and reach the common kind of memory of everybody, the actual sort of quality or production values of that image starts to, kind of get worse and become something that would be attributed by many as, a poor quality image of something. And how does that then start to play with memory? This is a very, if we're going back to, our kind of starting provocation of layers, what is it about digital media and then the pictorial or the painterly that then freezes that kind of transmission of the poor image in time into something that's then frozen and given a certain production value in its kind of paused state? What does that do? That's a complex, is it a question? I don't know, it's like a ramble of thoughts. Yeah.
Oh yeah, well, I also wanted to contribute to something, maybe through like some references that occurred to me. Earlier there was some discussion about the idea of like recreation and reenactment in regards to the space. And at first that made me think of pieces like the film The Act of Killing or the performance of Jeremy Deller's The Battle of Orgreave, and which have that kind of therapeutic element. But then actually I thought I was struck more by a comparison to this piece by the duo Langlands and Bell called Osama bin Laden's House, which is like a digital recreation of Osama bin Laden's house that you can interact with as if it's kind of a video game and you can just walk around it. But of course you almost don't want to. It has this, I think a bit like this space, it has this kind of distancing effect. And also it has that low quality feel. It does have that feel of a kind of like an early video game where the edges don't quite add up. And there's something maybe just inherent about kind of digital media that is a bit distancing, that is maybe part of the sort of, I don't know what you'd call like the poetics of the medium, perhaps. Yeah.
And the artist is explicit about those bought assets, those acquired assets that are then, you know, kind of transported onto the canvas, onto the site of the recreation or the kind of working through of memory. And what is it about? I mean, we've just been talking to a number of students who work very closely with bought assets, digital assets that then, right?
Yeah.
But then how does that then become part of your, you know, your work, your reclaiming of that space? Just because you buy a suite of noses, as you were saying before, what does that then do to your work? How do you then, you know, reclaim that space of control over the modes of or the means of production of an artwork?
Yeah, I think obviously the assets help me improve my work sufficient a lot, because like what I'm doing 3D modeling, I'm thinking like, what should I make a copy of reality, and should I make more abstract thing beyond it? And when I want to like make more abstract stuff, I will buy those ready-made models.
When I was watching the video at the beginning and she was talking about like her traumatic experience, before watching the artwork, I thought her print will be more like here, or maybe these characters would be some people she knew. And at the end, it was more like a mediatic or probably like icons that were important during the 9/11. So I think when it's more of a collective memory, I do think it's like very valid that she kind of like takes her hand away of the artwork, and I feel it's also like kind of like a respect to these people, and now that she's using this digital like aspect as well, it's like I don't know, the part of the trauma that we were talking before as well. For me, it brings like less of the trauma of 9/11. Like I was born when this happened, I was like far away, but it kind of like brings the trauma from digital era, like so kind of like getting her hand away of the artworks, kind of like starts questioning like what's going on with now the future of the digital and the arts, and like buying assets, like buying identities. So I think that's a valid point as an artist, and I think she can reach that because she has like taken her identity from the artwork.
I want to mention this before, but I understand that her earlier work, she focused a lot on like cubism and constructivism and futurism, right? So I find it quite interesting that she's collaborating, I mean, it's not AI, but she's collaborating with software to like construct things that are kind of similar to what she was doing before. It's a very similar way of arranging shape and like layers of things and putting things together. And I think it's just from a painting perspective that she's trying to erase the artist's hand is quite interesting, because it looks obviously like a print. It is a print, right? I understand. So it's interesting that though it goes through a machine, through a software, she has full control over it, and she has control over kind of constructing, like, I mean, even the space, this exhibition space, it is fake. And from what I also understand, the titles are called Deep Fake, right? Deep Fake Stan, I believe, and Deep Fake, I forgot. But so for me, it's quite interesting to think about that also, that a painter is engaging with technology in such a way that's quite unusual as well, so and quite unique. I think also the last thing I want to say, what Jerome was also mentioning about backspaces and also artificial intelligence, like generative art. What I find so interesting about like that discussion now as well is that when it comes to memory, machines, they work based on data, right? So, and then a human is, when we make creative decisions, we base it also on memory and research, and so I think that parallel is quite strong, and I don't know how to articulate it very well further on, but I do think it's very relevant and inspiring for I think like painters as well, like contemporary painters, to see how that collaboration can lead to different types of, I don't know.
I suppose really I would like to thank you all for bringing that to the exhibition and to the gallery here. It's kind of, it's great to bring such an array of talent and people who are practicing in your studio spaces every day in your practice, in your work. And the facilitation was fantastic to be done, and I have to thank obviously Raksha, Jerome, Ivan and Rachel, who really kind of were the glue who held us all together this evening, I feel. And but really, without you, the Painters on Painting event is very much for students of painting in its widest spectrum